know Terry and Holly a little bit anyway, and enough to know that he's so interesting in what he does for his work and his mission around the world, and especially in China. So tonight is called Descending Darkness in China, a First-Hand View. And in the last 3 years, the 90 million members of China's Communist Party, who rule China's one-party state, have sharply tightened their chokehold on China's huge population. In response to cries on all sides, China's leaders are intensifying their brutal rule through mass crackdowns on human rights lawyers and activists. Terry will talk to us about his longtime research in basic freedoms, civil society, and Christians in China, and his personal relationship with friends who have been disappeared. Also detained, interrogated, tortured, and charged with many crimes. Terry is a sociologist and is co-director of the Center on Law and Globalization. He has written several books and is published quite extensively. He has consulted with China's State Council, written extensively on China's commercial law reforms, and is quoted often by the media, including the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, BuzzFeed, among others. So I ask you all to welcome Terry Hallidegger.
Thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Terry, for that welcome. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Being here on a summer evening in North Creek talking about a topic as dark as tonight's topic is a strange combination. But I'm particularly glad that we're together tonight because this last week in China has been one of the darkest weeks for those of us who care about rule of law or constitutionalism or human rights or basic legal freedoms for the past 2 or 3 decades, probably since June the 4th and the massacre in Tiananmen Square in 1989. This is the end of a week of secret trials where some of my friends have been sentenced. It's at the end of a very harrowing year, and so I'm going to be talking tonight about the way in which my own research and the way in which the fortunes of people that we have been studying for a long time tell us something about where China is right now and raise some questions about where China may be going in the future. On the 28th of June in 2015, I met with the woman that you see in your handout there, Wang Yu, in an upscale mall in downtown Beijing. I had heard about Wang Yu for the last couple of years, but I hadn't met her. I've been doing research with my Chinese co-author, Sida Liu, for many years on Chinese law and criminal justice system. I hadn't heard mention of this woman, and then all of a sudden she appeared taking on some of the most difficult topics in China. She was somebody who had represented 5 feminists who got tremendous coverage inside China and eventually were suppressed by the government. She had been engaged in defending a very famous case where a school principal had been raping students without any kind of restraint, and a woman came and stood in front of the high school entrance with a sign, and the woman said, if you want to be safe, you can spend the night with me. And that woman, not the principal, was the person who was arrested and detained. She was somebody who defended an influential Islamic intellectual who has been sent to prison for many years. So these were cases, the most difficult cases that a lawyer could take in China. So I was very keen to meet with Wang Yu, and I was extraordinarily impressed by her. A woman of quiet dignity, a woman who was very eloquent, and indeed a woman with an interior of steel that one couldn't readily see until one began to talk about her and to talk about her courage. And one of the questions that I asked her was about something unprecedented that had happened a month before. For the first time, to our knowledge, in many, many years, at least in the last 20 years, China's state media on one day, its print media, its television media, its online media, attacked this particular woman by name in a coordinated campaign, trying to shame her for her role as a criminal lawyer. And so I asked Wang Yu about her story, and she said, look, I'm a commercial lawyer by training. I'm a commercial lawyer by practice. And in 2012, she was on a railway station in Tianjin, a port city in China, where there was a huge explosion you may have read about a few months ago. And she got into some kind of altercation, and the railway police got involved. The railway police have their own legal system inside China. She was arrested. She was accused, this diminutive woman, of beating up some men on the platform, and sent to prison for 2.5 years. And when she came out of prison, she was a radical criminal defense and human rights lawyer. And people were constantly amazed about, even her fellow human rights lawyers were amazed about the cases that she took on. So I spoke to her on the 28th of June. 11 days later, Wang Yu and her husband, who's also an eminent rights lawyer, and their 16-year-old son went to Beijing International Airport. Some of you have been at that airport, and they were sending their son to Australia to learn a form of English, which many of us think is quite a superior form of English. And so she dropped off her son and her husband and then drove home. And at 3 o'clock in the morning, she texted some of her friends saying the power has been cut off and my telephone has been turned off. A few minutes later, she texted saying somebody is trying to break into my apartment. And then she disappeared. And the next day, neighbors reported that some 20 or 30 men dressed in black garb had burst into the apartment saying it was a drug raid. And she literally disappeared, as the Chinese say, disappeared from sight for months. Nobody knew who she was. She had no access to lawyers, none to foreign diplomats, none to her family. She dropped completely out of sight. But it turns out that that was the beginning of a national campaign. And that brings me to the second photo that you see there with the gentleman I'm standing with. Li Heping is his name. Li Heping was 24 hours after Wang Yu also disappeared. This man I've known for a very long time, spent countless hours with him in various parts of Beijing, talking to him about his practice. He is probably the dean of human rights lawyers still inside China, and until that time, outside jail. We ourselves have had one or two small adventures dodging the security and surveillance police, but I always found him an extremely thoughtful, quietly charismatic person. This was a person, again, who had led many younger lawyers to take on human rights, defending people in China who have been exposed to the worst predations of China's development and the worst repression of the party. He came from a very poor background in Hunan province. He came to Beijing. He built a community of human rights lawyers around him. He also became a pivotal figure for Christian human rights lawyers. He himself became a Christian. His brother became a Christian. And before very long, they had a circle of human rights lawyers. In fact, this was something that I accidentally stumbled upon doing different research, that a disproportionate number of China's human rights lawyers, Protestant Christians, they come from house churches. Li Heping had always known at any moment he could be taken. He often told me this. And like all of these human rights lawyers, he was always prepared. And he was indeed taken that 24 hours later. And in this week that we've just had of secret trials, I've been waiting day after day to find out if he has been sentenced. And according to the New York Times or the BBC today, possibly in the next day or two. I'll come back to that. On August the 25th, another young lawyer friend of mine, Zhang Kai, was disappeared in Zhejiang province. Zhejiang province is a very rich province on the east coast of China. It's a province where a large number of Christians are concentrated. Zhang Kai is a very sophisticated guy, has an elite education, unlike many of these other human rights lawyers. He's been in the United States. He and I did a seminar together at Wisconsin Law School a couple of years ago. He's testified in Congress. And he had taken on, like some of these other lawyers, many notable cases. One was the poison milk case. You may have read about it. thousands of babies were given poisoned milk because the powder milk manufacturing company had adulterated the milk with a chemical that gave babies gallstones. And so all over China, hundreds of thousands of babies were affected. The government did not crack down on the company. It cracked down on the people who complained about the company's treatment of them. And Li Changkai was one of the people who represented the parents. He was a person who'd been very effective in defending migrants. In China, as you know, there are a huge number of migrants who migrate inside China from rural areas into urban areas, but they don't have the appropriate documents and the passes to be in an urban area. And for that reason, they are vulnerable to economic exploitation, they're vulnerable to persecution from the police, and he represented them. He also had an extremely strong presence in the social media, with tens and hundreds of thousands of people following his blog. And so in Zhejiang province over the last 12 or 18 months, there has been a very strong attack on Protestant churches. It started off by just taking off their crosses, forcing them to take down the crosses on the church. Some of these churches were absolutely gargantuan, 7, 10, 12 stories high. The government said that exceeded permits. You've got to lop off the top 2 stories or the top 4 stories. And then the campaign intensified and churches began to be destroyed. And so there has been a huge struggle in Zhejiang. Chiang Kai was in the middle of it, and he eventually was disappeared for his leadership. In fact, the circumstances of his disappearance were very interesting indeed, because the United States, inside the State Department, has a special division concerned with religious freedom. And the director, the ambassador for religious freedom, is a rabbi, David Saperstein. And David Saperstein had an appointment to meet with Chiang Kai and 5 other Christian defense lawyers on August the 26th. And they were all disappeared the night before. And Saperstein was absolutely furious. Indeed, the whole US diplomatic establishment in China was furious. They took this as a frontal assault on diplomatic niceties. But what the 3 of these personal stories, for me personal, because I know at least 2 of these people very well, Wang Yu I'd only spent an hour or 2 with. These 3 people presaged a crackdown that has been without any kind of parallel in China, and indeed without any kind of parallel anywhere in the world for the last several decades. The party state essentially sought to lop off the entire top of the criminal human rights bar in China in a matter of hours. And so if you look at the diagram at the bottom of the handout there, you'll see that in the so-called 709 crackdown, July 9, 2015, over a series of months, but mostly right at the beginning, 317 people were taken. This is according to a human rights organization based in Hong Kong. Down in the bottom left-hand corner there, you'll see 267 of them were taken and briefly questioned and sent home. What we need to understand here is that the taking of them and the questioning of them was first of all a form of intimidation, to quieten them down, to have them cease and desist some of the stronger campaigns that they were taking on. But they were also released frequently only after they had signed a statement that they would commit no longer to representing certain kinds of clients. Several others of the people you'll see have been forbidden to leave the country. But for our purposes tonight, the most crucial group is in the top right-hand corner there, the group that eventually was arrested, 21 people. And it is these people that represent sort of the climactic moment that we're seeing this week when their secret trials have occurred. So the experiences of these lawyers over the last 12 months and up to the present time personify, in my view and the view of many other China specialists in this area, a very sharp turn for the worse in China's legal system, in China's politics, in China's civil society, and I'm going to suggest to you towards the end for all of us as well. Tonight I'm going to talk a little about why this is unprecedented. I'm going to ask what are the impacts of this crackdown that we can see so far. Are there any positives that have come out of this crackdown, even unanticipated positives? and then to ask the fundamental question I think everybody overseas is asking, and hundreds of millions of people are asking inside China: what does this present set of circumstances augur for China's own future? Sandy mentioned in brief at the beginning, for the last 15 years I've been doing research on China, partly on its commercial legal system, partly on its regulation of professions, but for the last many years with a young China scholar on its criminal justice system. And that's research that's been supported by the National Science Foundation in the United States, which interestingly enough has taken an interest in finding out more about what's going on inside China. And part of our research question has been, to what extent are these lawyers indicative of developments inside Chinese society that we cannot see directly, because we're excluded from certain kinds of evidence collecting, certain kinds of information simply isn't available to us in an authoritarian country that's available to us in an open political society. And so we were searching to get a sense of whether or not some of the dynamism that has been seen by other legal professions in other political revolutions, or in political revolutions, might also be in its early stages in China. In Tunisia, for example, it was lawyers, among 2 or 3 other groups, that led part of the Arab Spring revolution that then ran across the top of North Africa. It was lawyers who have been central in a number of political struggles in other countries. So to what extent was this the case in China? I said that for me and for many China observers, what's happened over the last year is unprecedented, and that should be a great source of concern for us. It's unprecedented in the first place because, if you'll turn your page, for the first time, this was a crackdown that was nationwide. Many of these lawyers had previously been detained. In 2011, there was a crackdown around the time of the Arab Spring, when many, including Li Heping, had been taken and tortured. There was a crackdown in 2007, but it was usually only of a few leading lawyers in Beijing. But if you look at this map, which is impossible to read, it's so tiny, you'll see that it covers most of China's provinces. And while the largest number of people are from Beijing, because that's where the rights lawyers congregated, there are a very large number from Guangdong province, from Zhejiang province, indeed all of the eastern provinces, including some of the central provinces like Henan and Hunan. The second unprecedented feature of this crackdown was the public shaming campaign that began with Wang Yu. None of these lawyers could remember a time when the media, the state media, had been coordinated to focus on a single person in order to shame her in front of the Chinese public. I asked her about this. How did she feel about it? What were her reactions to it? She said the government is trying to ruin my reputation online. But she said I take 2 very encouraging messages from this. Number 1, what I'm doing is so important and so threatening to the government that they feel they've got to take this unprecedented step. So I'm making a difference. Number 2, she said the effect of my human rights community everybody has got together, and in Chinese she said they are getting warmed, we're all getting warm together. People are gathering around me in solidarity. A third and a very troubling development has been the emergence of public confessions. These high-profile lawyers, who already had large publics inside China, mostly through the social media, now are being put on state television and publicly confessing to their crimes against the party and the state. So on the right-hand side there, at the top, you'll see Zhang Kai. He certainly doesn't look like the sophisticated commercial lawyer whom I've got to know over so many years, or the man who was leading the seminar at the University of Wisconsin Law School. And Zhang Kai, supposedly in this, this is a snapshot from a public confession that he made. People are very troubled about this for a number of reasons. First of all, there's been no trial. So in a sense, the person is being tried in the media. Very troubling for those people who remember the predations of the Cultural Revolution is that this seems to be harking back to the Cultural Revolution. It seems to be harking back to Soviet experiments that we remember during the Cold War. Strangely, we've heard that after Chiang Kai was released, he swears that he never did make such a public confession. He says that he was being secretly recorded while he was being interrogated, and the government patched together a confession. Now, it's become clear from the trials this week that so far each person, one major lawyer, has been tried and convicted and sentenced a day over the last 5 days, including today. And in each case, they have, except for today's case, who was a Christian pastor, in each case, they have made a, quote, public confession. So what do we make of these public confessions? Well, one thing we know is that what they say publicly is certainly what people like me, who have talked to them for endless hours, and other people who know them well, there's a complete variance between what they've said in the past and to their public constituencies and what the government says they are now saying. In the second place, it's clear that these people have been subject to complete isolation, to psychological and physical torture for the last 12 months. Jerry Cohen, who's probably the leading US China specialist. He's actually been practicing law in China for almost 50 years, but was also an academic at New York University Law School. Cohen wrote on his blog this week that he thinks that the confessions from Wang Yu from this Monday are an indication that for the first time for decades China is bringing back the brainwashing that China indulged in, Korea indulged in, North Korea indulged in the 1950s. A fourth way in which this was unprecedented is that a fear that many of these lawyers told me about in 2012, 2013 has come to pass. China's criminal procedure law, about which my co-author and I have been writing, and criminal procedure practice, was reformed in 1996 and then reformed again in 2012. Over the years, these lawyers had always been exposed to the possibility they could be dragged off the street and disappear. In fact, I once remember a very sobering meeting I had with a lawyer called Zhang Tianyong in a darkened upstairs restaurant in downtown Beijing. And I once asked him, what did he fear most? And he had already been disbarred, he had already been interrogated, he'd already been taken off the streets. He said, what I fear most is that one day I'll be walking down the street and a van will pull up alongside me and people will leap out and grab me, pull me into the van, put a black hood, this is a sort of a term of art of Chinese fear-mongering, a black hood on my head, and I will disappear. And I came back to the US, and 2 weeks later in the New York Times, it reported that exactly that had happened to Zhang Tianyong. So these lawyers had been disappeared in the past, but in the 2012 criminal procedure law, an article, Article 73, was added to the law which says that state security could take people into residential surveillance, quote unquote, for up to 6 months if the crime was serious enough to warrant this special kind of treatment. And when the human rights lawyers saw it, they immediately said, this is an effort to legalize the disappearances that we've all experienced in the past. And if this gets passed, we are all vulnerable. And indeed, it is exactly this provision that has been invoked with all of the lawyers who I've mentioned by name, and with many of those 317 people that have been detained over the last year. This legalization of disappearances is something indeed that modern dictatorships that need to always talk the talk of law have increasingly engaged upon, a legalization of something that previously they did as a matter of course. And so all the rights activists agree that if you can take somebody off the street, even legally, this is tantamount to an invitation to torture. And I've heard this many times from these lawyers saying, we disappear, we're put in so-called black prisons, we don't know where we are, we move from one prison to another, and then they will describe in graphic detail what happens to them in those circumstances. A fifth reason that this is unprecedented is that there has emerged over the last 12 months something quite extraordinary, and that is China's government engaging in kidnapping of Chinese in other countries and bringing them back into China. If you look at the handout there, you'll see the young man who is Wang Yu's son, 16-year-old, now 17. When his mother and his father were disappeared, he was put under house arrest, released into the custody of his grandmother. And two family friends, knowing that he would be used as a lever against his parents, two family friends tried to get him out of China. And they did. They got him into Burma, but not far enough, because he was only there a day or two, and China's security apparatus went into Burma, grabbed him, grabbed the two people that he was with, and brought him back to China. And this rather sad and poignant photograph on the left, the woman in the black hair, that's Wang Yu being told at the very moment about her son being kidnapped and brought back to China. She was told this on a national television. And so she just bursts into tears as she hears that her son has come back, and now that kind of leverage can be exercised against him. As one human rights activist said in the international media, this is the most disgusting thing I've seen in 20 years of activism in China. A sixth reason that this is an unprecedented set of actions is the targeting of family members. So the kidnapping of this young man is a very dramatic instance of something that all these lawyers report. Wang Yu once, she told me in this meeting last year, she said, sometimes they hassle my family. See, if my husband's not at home and my mom's almost 70, the police will come to the door and they'll say something threatening, or they'll say that I've had a heart attack, or they'll say that I've been shot. We've had this now, this use of family members. Here's a child being used against his mother. Li Heping's brother was also taken, so a brother being used against brother. Other family members are brought in to bring pressure on those people who've been disappeared to make confessions. And now a new vanguard of activists has emerged in China dramatically over the last several weeks, and that is the wives of people like Li Heping. So there's a spectacular photograph taken of 4 wives on Chang'an Avenue that many of you have seen, just a block or two from Tiananmen Square, standing outside the Supreme People's Procuracy. They have on white clothes, and in Chinese lettering, they're saying things like, "Release my husband," or "Where is my husband?" And so these wives have now emerged as a force, but they too were seized. On Friday, they tried to go to the detention center in Tianjin to find out where their husbands were, and they themselves were taken this time last week. Another development that goes to the fundamentals of the rule of law, and that is the government for the first time has been firing the lawyers chosen by the human rights lawyers before they were seized. So all these lawyers, as I earlier said, know that they could go at any time. So they've always got legal counsel retained to defend them when they're taken. Astonishingly, this little handwritten note that you can see here on the right-hand side, this is Jiang Kai writing in his own handwriting a letter firing his own chosen lawyer because the state has decided to provide its lawyer to supposedly defend him. So all of the lawyers who were tried this week had their own lawyers dismissed, and the state had stepped in with its own very compliant lawyer. Even more troubling is that the severity of the charges over the last year of these brought against these human rights lawyers have become far more severe. In the past, when they were pulled in and subject to the criminal justice system, they would essentially be charged with disturbing the peace or disturbing social stability. In the last several months, they have now been charged with subverting the state, with undermining state security. So these are essentially charges equivalent to treason, and they bring sentences from 10 to 15 years to life imprisonment. Perhaps the most eminent expert on human rights lawyers, Eva Pills, at King's College London, says that under the current president of China, Xi Jinping, the state has moved from what she calls public order charges, offending social stability, to a national security set of charges. And last, this, as we have seen just in the last week, the last reason, the ninth reason that this is an unprecedented move in modern China is that this week these people were tried in secret trials. So now we're back to what we remember from the Soviet Union in the 1930s, what we heard in the late 1950s in the great struggles inside China. So there's not even a pretense of legality in these secret trials. And so this week, one day after the other, we've had Wang Yu convicted and then supposedly released on bail. But like a young woman released, Li Heping's assistant released a couple of months ago, nobody has seen her, including her family and her husband. She got a 3-year suspended sentence. But as Tang Biao, a distinguished China human rights lawyer at Harvard Law School, once said to me, going from one kind of jail, being released into the public domain, where you're still under strict surveillance, is going from a small prison into a large prison. A Christian activist on Tuesday got 3 years for subverting the state. The managing director of the law firm that Wang Yu and her husband were in, the most activist law firm in China, supposedly confessed. He got 7 years yesterday for subverting the state. In each of these cases, they've written so-called public confessions. And in these public confessions, they say that they were mistakenly used by foreign organizations and foreign government, in particular the US. They say that they have inadvertently smeared China. And in the case of Wang Yu, who has just been awarded a very distinguished International Human Rights Prize by the American Bar Association, it will be awarded to her in absentia tomorrow. She said she rejects all international awards in her confession. I think this is one reason why Cohen believes that brainwashing has come back and come back strongly. So altogether, we have seen in the last 13 months, and particularly at the end of this week, a drastic ratcheting up of the severity of repression in China. To most China specialists, it's a move from what was already an authoritarian government in a distinctly totalitarian direction. Unfortunately, it's doing it often underneath the veneer of legality. So what are the impacts of this crackdown? Well, the intended impacts seem quite clear. It's an effort to silence the lawyers, because the lawyers themselves are in a sense the spokespersons for the worst treated people in China. It's an attempt to suppress the use of law to deal with grievances that previously the government had stimulated and now has reversed its position on. Not least, I think you'll see tomorrow in a story in the New York Times, it's an attempt to strangle civil society, to crush any kind of dissenting voices, not least the Christian church. And ultimately, of course, it's a despotic move by the Chinese Communist Party to maintain its extraordinary control over China, but to ratchet that control up in ways we've not seen. The BBC said today, in a rather brilliant commentary, that it's an effort, these trials this week, culminate a year in an effort to stir a politics of fear. What's been its impact on lawyers? Well, 2 months ago, people were saying that while legal institutions were being shut down somewhat, people were still acting boldly. There was still public protests inside China. 100 lawyers the day after Wang Yu was taken signed an online letter of appeal that she'd be freed. But today, there is agreement that China's lawyers and China's legal system is in, quote, survival mode. Clearly it's an effort to intimidate the public, to keep the public away from criminal defense and rights lawyers. Pills, the scholar in London, said, quote, the government propaganda is sending an intimidating warning message to the entire profession, in fact the entire nation via television, about rights advocacy being criminalized. So now human rights lawyers are enemies of the state, of the party, and indeed of China. In fact, today and in the last 2 or 3 days, the government has released some videos arguing that these lawyers are leading, quote, a color revolution of the kind that we saw in Eastern Europe at the end of the Soviet period. They criticize, the video says explicitly, if you, the Chinese people, want another Arab Spring, if you want China to dissolve like the Soviet Union dissolved, if you want to turn into another Iraq, if you want to be another Syria, then these are the people you should follow. These are people being led by Western forces in order to produce those kinds of circumstances inside China. Are there any positive consequences in what is otherwise a dark story? One of the interesting struggles inside China has been between the public security part of the state and the propaganda part of the state. And it seems that in the beginning of this crackdown, the public security, the secret police, had the dominant position, and they created for the Chinese government a public relations disaster for the world. Wang Yu, you can see, is a most appealing person, and many stories have been written about her in the international media. Li Heping's assistant that I mentioned, Zhao Wei, 24 years old, a beautiful young woman, wasn't even yet qualified as a lawyer, disappeared for a year? How on earth did the Chinese state think itself to be threatened by a young woman like this? And so she's very photogenic, and the international media made a very strong set of cases about her situation. A marvelous story written by The Guardian just before Christmas featured her in particular. Zhang Kai is a Christian and is very eloquent and is known not only to Christian organizations around the world, but to international human rights organizations, Amnesty International, Human Rights Watch. So the very lawyers that they crack down on are lawyers that have tremendous international connections of one sort or another. And so the result has been that for the first time, there has been a mobilization of groups that never really used to talk to each other before. The international Christian organizations really never used to have much to do with Amnesty International. The Guardian newspaper, which is sort of a left of centre newspaper in Britain, never really had to do much with religion or faith. And the severity of this crackdown has somehow or other managed to have these various groups outside China coalesce. Outside China, bar associations across the world are mobilized. I can talk more about that in our discussion if you would like. The American Bar Association at last took a position after some people said they had did it for an entire year. My own research institution was involved in an international campaign to bring legal notables around the world. We drafted a letter that was sent to Xi Jinping at the end of January. It was simultaneously released by The Guardian and the New York Times, with stories in Le Monde and Die Welt in Germany, as an attempt to try and get beyond the usual players, the human rights groups who are making these kinds of cases. In fact, I asked Sophie Richardson, who was involved in this enterprise and who is the human rights director for China for Human Rights Watch, I asked her, does all the work that we went into to produce this letter make a difference? She said, yes, I think in two ways. She said it enabled the United States to line up 12 other countries in the Human Rights Council in Geneva in order to bring a very strong statement against China. And she said the second way is that everybody expects Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch to raise the flag when there's injustice. But she said when legal notables, eminent former Minister of Justice in France, or distinguished Australian jurists, or the former legal counsel of the United Nations, when they sign something, the world takes notice. So let me conclude. What does this augur, not just for these lawyers, but what does it tell us about China? right now. And whatever is going on in China is telling us something about the rest of the world. So one of the reasons that we began studying these human rights lawyers is that it's an indirect way to do what otherwise is very hard to do inside an authoritarian country. And that's to get your finger on the pulse of the deep social and economic and health and environmental and material problems that are underneath the surface inside China, underneath that facade of modernity that you see in Shanghai or Beijing. Lawyers, for a while, were the one group, one of the very few groups to whom victims could go. So the lawyers became spokespersons for the most victimized, the most persecuted of groups, and the lawyers seemed to offer a peaceful way forward, a non-violent way forward, an orderly way forward. In other words, as the BBC said today, it offered hope. But now we can see in our media that hope outside and inside China is disappearing. The economy is sliding, and you can be sure it's much worse than we're reading in the media. Pollution is an enormous problem, as any of us know, who've been in any Chinese city for any length of time, particularly Beijing. A number of freedoms that opened up have now contracted. The internet, especially the social media, are very heavily censored at the present time. The world is being increasingly and very effectively shut out. And, perhaps most important, peaceable paths for transformation are now off the table. As a commentator said a couple of weeks ago, what we are therefore seeing in China is the pressure cooker problem. Hundreds of millions of people in China are victims, are angry, have been left behind, have had their land taken off them, have had their children poisoned, have had their family die of cancer because of what's being put in the river that flows past their home. And they've had no way to redress those wrongs, except perhaps to go through the courts, to go through lawyers. And now that has been taken away from them. So it appears to me and a number of my other colleagues who work on these problems that Xi Jinping is making an enormous gamble at this moment. He's throwing all his dice on the possibility that the Chinese Communist Party, 7% of China's population, 80 or 90 million people, are going to be able to concentrate power, use nationalism, brutality, and force as a way of shutting down dissent, and that the party is going to be able to maintain control during these very difficult economic and other times that are coming. In fact, in my estimation as somebody who studies the fight for basic legal freedoms across the world, this is a path towards fear and terror. It's a path towards despotism. It's a path back to totalitarianism. And so the fate of China's lawyers, what we've seen in the last few days, what we saw today, is a litmus test of where China seems to be going. The last 12 months or so indicate, in my view, that China is heading into a dark age. For how long it will occur, and with what consequences, nobody dares predict. But I suggest to you, and certainly for myself, I think we need to watch these lawyers very, very closely, because their fate is going to tell us a great deal about China's future, and indeed, therefore, our own. Thank you. Thank you. So, comments? Yes.
The United States and China are members of the World Trade Organization, and the courts that are set up by WTO are supposed to adjudicate commercial disputes. If the legal system in China, in effect, goes away, then how can business contracts and labor contracts be relied on? And can the United States apply any pressure on China to reverse this?
That's exactly the question that the international business community should be asking of China. If China can abuse the law so thoroughly inside its own territory, if it can reject the opinion 2 weeks ago by the International Arbitration Panel on the South China Sea, Why should anybody outside China take terribly seriously business agreements? Why should it imagine that any assets are going to be safe inside China? I wrote a book on China's corporate bankruptcy system, restructuring its economy through corporate failures, corporate restructuring. In theory, the law was going to take over what the law is supposed to do in market economies. When companies get into financial difficulty, and the markets and the creditors and the debtors would sort it out amongst them. The government killed the law almost immediately in practice. Essentially, it stepped in and made those decisions on political grounds, not on commercial or on legal grounds. And so politics is always going to triumph the economy in China.
I have several friends in China, in Fujian, in Henan, Shanghai, and Beijing, who are admittedly parts of the elites, and they contend that it already is a totalitarian state, that President Xi has more power than anyone since Stalin, that he has completely co-opted the Politburo, and that the climate in the entire country among the elites is one of fear because, and here's a parallel to the American contemporary political situation, he is running against the elites. He is positioning himself as the man of the people, as the man against corruption, as the man who brings these westernized people to justice, and therefore remains enormously powerful. So I guess my question is threefold. What's the likelihood of his falling? What's the likelihood of his losing favor with the party, which he seems to have overtaken completely? And what is finally the likelihood that people will be able to disassociate themselves from him because they're so taken with him, the common people around the country?
So we know that the communist, thank you, because those are absolutely critical questions that are being debated among the China watchers at present. Over the last 2 or 3 years, there was a tremendous intra-party fight between a faction led by Bourgeois, who had been the party chief in Chongqing, and who was, people thought at the time, a kind of a Maoist cult figure, a very passionate, a very impressive figure, who many people found very compelling, given the rather dull leadership that the party had offered in the previous 2 sets of party transitions. Xi Jinping very effectively dethroned Bourgeois. Bourgeois is now in jail for life. He has been effectively trying to purge the party from Bourgeois supporters. And so that continues. But Bourgeois' faction is not the only faction inside the party. There's another faction inside the party, and that is the faction of the previous president, Jiang Zemin, based in Shanghai. And his people are still very strong inside the party. And his people are people who have a much, I hate to use the word moderate, but a less totalitarian concept of what China should be or where China should go. And that's a fight that's still going on at present. And so the China watchers, I'm part of a China network of diplomats and journalists and China specialists, are constantly trying to engage in what we used to do with the old Soviet Union, look at parades to see who had moved 3 positions to the left or the right, closer to Brezhnev or Stalin, in order to figure out who's losing favor or who's not. The current talk is that the premier, who is not hard-lined enough, is going to be sidelined and dismissed in the next week or 2. Who knows if that's true? So what we don't really know is that is the extent to which Xi Jinping really has the degree of mass support that Tom was talking about. He clearly has lots of mass support. But how big is that support? And to what extent can he use that support against the other factions? But quite apart from the elites, what we forget about China is that literally hundreds of millions of people have been left behind. These people are a potentially explosive force. And we saw when one street vendor set himself on fire in North Africa, it produced a political revolution. So Xi Jinping knows full well that he is sitting on a volcano. Can he stop the volcano from blowing? None of us really know. What we've seen this week demonstrates that he is very fearful, I've been writing about this in the last few weeks, and I think we'll see something about this in tomorrow's New York Times, or Sunday's New York Times. And so he's gambled that fear is the way forward. But just like the great aphorism we recall with Stalin and the Pope, how many divisions does the Pope control? Well, the Catholic Church seems to be still going strong 2,000 years later, and Stalin and the Soviet Union is gone. Can you rule 1.4 billion people through fear alone? No.
What are the top 3 things those of us in this room can do?
Well, that's a great question. The first thing we can do is what we've just done tonight, to talk about this. So I will tweet today, when I get home, and say that in North Creek, New York, people like us were talking about these people in China. These people are frequently people who are isolated, who feel that the world has forgotten them. They have no idea what international coverage there is. And that word will get back and give great encouragement to people. That even in a small place that they've never heard of, people are talking about them and are talking about their situation. The second thing is we need to be asking our government how strong a stand it's taking on these issues. There's a tug, as there was with Nazi Germany in the 1930s, between business interests often on the one side and political human rights issues on the other side. Many people think that the Obama administration, I'm an Obama supporter, the Obama administration has not been so strong on human rights as the George W. Bush administration was. So how is the US government going to deal with this human rights issue? And then I think the third way we can make a difference is by getting reports from Human Rights Watch, subscribing to the apps of Amnesty International, of joining in blogs from the China reporters of The Guardian. Christopher Buckley, the lead China correspondent of the New York Times, has a great set of columns that stories that he runs every 3 or 4 days, and replying to them so that people can see the action that's being generated. Great question.
Terry,
Yes.
what was the cause of this decline and this whole situation evolving over the several years, I realize, but I mean, 20 years ago, they weren't experiencing this type of thing quite so badly, were they?
Yes, and I think you're thinking about what we all rightly